In the autumn of 1887, in a played-out lead camp called Cedar Bench in the western reaches of Montana Territory, a girl of 19 stood at the edge of a stone-lined pit that no man in 3 counties would go near, and she did not look away from it. The pit belonged to an abandoned tannery she had bought that morning for $1, paid in a single silver coin worn smooth by other hands, and the men who took her money had laughed the whole time they counted it. They told her she had bought a hole in the ground, and the stink that came out of it. They told her the last tanner had walked off and never come back, that the vats were full of rot, that the great pit at the center of the yard had been sealed under a lid of fitted timber and river clay for the better part of 14 years, and that whatever was down there was nobody's business and never would be. The girl, whose name was Della Fenn, folded the receipt they gave her and put it inside her coat against her ribs and said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that the people who laughed the loudest were usually the ones who had never once gone and looked. What none of them knew, standing there in the cold, with their hands in their pockets, was that Della had been raised at the elbow of the only man in the territory who had understood how a tannery truly worked, and that the thing sealed in that pit had been put there by him, and that she had come back to Cedar Bench for one reason only: to open it. I want you to stay with her through the work that follows, because the world is full of things people sealed shut and walked away from, and almost none of them are empty. Keep that in your mind as the days get colder. Della had not chosen to be in Cedar Bench. She had been put out. 6 weeks earlier, in a sod house 40 miles east on the Musselshell, her stepfather had set her belongings on the step in a flour sack, and told her there was no more room and no more food and no more patience, and that a girl of 19 with no husband and no prospects was a drain a man could not be expected to carry. Her mother had stood at the window and not come out. Della had taken the sack and the $4 sewn into the hem of her second dress, and she had walked to the freight road and waited. And she had not wept, because weeping was a thing she had stopped doing at 14, when the only person who ever wept for her had died. That person was Augustus Reed, and he had been a tanner. Not a backyard hide scraper, but a true tanner, trained in the old way in a river town in Pennsylvania, before the war. A man who could take a green hide stripped from a dead animal and turn it, through months of patient chemistry and brutal labor, into leather that would outlast the man who wore it. He had come west in 1862 and set up his works at Cedar Bench when the lead camp was new and full of money, and for 11 years he had made the finest harness, leather and sole leather, between Fort Benton and the Yellowstone. And for the last 4 of those years, after his wife died and his own daughter went east and did not write, he had kept a thin, watchful girl from a failing homestead as his apprentice, because she asked good questions, and because her small hands were steady. She was the only person who ever listened to the whole of an answer instead of half. He had taught her everything. He had taught her how to read a hide by the feel of its grain, how to judge the strength of a tanning liquor by its color and its bite, how to build a fire that would hold one heat for a day and a night without wavering. He had taught her the chemistry of bark and lime and the slow magic of the pits, where hides lay submerged in liquor for a year or more, while the tannin crept into the fiber and made it permanent. And he had taught her, near the end when his hands had begun to shake and his breath came short, that the most important thing a tanner owned was not his stock or his vats, but his patience, because leather could not be hurried, and neither, he said, could justice, and the two were more alike than most men knew. Della had not understood that last part. She had been 15. She understood it now. Augustus Reed had died in the spring of 1873, and within a month his works had been seized for a debt he did not owe, sold off, and shuttered, and Della had been sent back to a family that did not want her. For 14 years she had carried the memory of his voice and the small, leather-handled tools he had pressed into her hands the week before he died, and she had carried something else as well. A thing he had told her in the last clear hour of his life, holding her wrist so hard it left a mark, his eyes fixed on hers to be sure she heard the whole of it. He had told her that he had sealed the great pit himself, that what was in it was not hides, and that one day when she was strong enough to do the work and old enough to be believed, she was to come back and open it, and bring up what he had hidden and put right what had been done to him. She had promised a girl of 15, promising a dying man. She had kept the promise inside her like a stone swallowed whole. So when the freight road brought her west and she heard that the old reed tannery at Cedar Bench was being sold for back taxes for whatever a person would pay to take it off the county's books, she had walked the last 11 miles and paid her $1 and taken the laughter without a flinch. The works were hers now. The pit was hers. And the man who had laughed loudest, a heavy land agent named Sumter Pyle, who held the paper on half the dead camp, had no idea that he had just sold the one thing in the world he should have burned. The tannery sat in a fold of ground below the bench, where a spring fed a stone-lined channel that had once kept the vats full. 14 years of neglect had not been kind. The drying sheds had lost half their roofs, and the long racks where hides had hung were gray and split. The bark mill, a great wheel of oak that had once ground tan bark to powder, stood frozen and furred with moss. The smell the men had warned her of was real, a deep sour mineral reek of old lime and rotted organic matter, and it sat over the whole yard like a held breath. Della walked the ground slowly, the way Augustus had taught her to walk a strange works, naming each thing to herself as she passed it, taking its measure. She did not flinch at the smell. She had grown up inside it. At the center of the yard was the pit. It was larger than the others, a square of fitted stone, perhaps 12 feet on a side. And where the other pits stood open and empty and full of black water, this one was sealed. A lid of heavy timber box had been laid across it and the seams packed with river clay, now hard as fired brick, and over the clay a layer of flat stones had been set so that no rain could work through. It was a tanner's seal, made to last, made to keep air and water out for a long time. Della knelt at its edge and laid her hand flat on the cold stone, and she felt, under the dirt of 14 years, the faint regular ridges where a chisel had dressed the clay smooth. His hands had done that. She knew his work, the way she knew her own breathing. She did not open it that day. She was not foolish. A pit sealed that long could hold foul air that would drop a person where they stood, and the work of breaking the seal would take tools she did not yet have, and a strength she would have to build day by day. So she did the thing Augustus would have done. She made the place habitable first. She cleared a corner of the soundest shed, and patched the roof with split shakes she rived from a fallen log. She freed the spring channel of muck, so that clean water ran again. She set snares for rabbits and traded 2 skins in town for flour and a sack of beans and a second-hand mattock, and she ignored the looks and the low remarks, and she came back and worked until the light failed. It was on the 3rd day that the old man found her. He came down the track on a mule, an enormous weathered man with a white beard stained yellow at the corners and one milky eye. And he sat the mule at the edge of the yard and watched her sledge a fallen post out of the way for a long while before he spoke. His name was Tobias Quint, and he had been the camp blacksmith in the years when the camp was alive, and he had known Augustus Reed well. He told her this in a flat, careful voice, watching her face the way a man watches to see if a horse will bolt. He had seen the tannery sold, he said. He had seen plenty of fools buy, plenty of worthless ground. He had never, though, seen one walk it and name the parts the way she had, and so he had come down to see who she was. Della told him. She told him plainly, without ornament, that she had been Reed's apprentice, that he had died owing nothing, and been robbed of everything, and that she had come to open the sealed pit because he had asked her to. She did not tell him what was in it, because she did not herself know, not exactly. Tobias Quint was quiet for a long time. Then he climbed down off the mule, which was a slow and complaining business, and he walked to the sealed pit and stood over it, and when he turned back, his milky eye was wet. He told her a thing she had not known. He told her that in the last year of his life, Augustus Reed had grown afraid, that he had taken to working the pits alone at night, that a man from the Territorial Land Office, a man with a banker's soft hands and a clerk's careful manner, had come to Cedar Bench 3 times that year, and met with Reed behind closed doors, and that after the 3rd meeting, Reed had sealed the great pit in a single night, working until dawn, and had told no one why, and that the man with the soft hands had been named on the paper that seized the tannery for debt 1 month after Reed was in the ground. As the creditor, the man's name was Halloran, Emmett Halloran, and he was not dead. He sat now in a tall stone house in Helena and held a seat on the Territorial Assembly and was spoken of as a man who would be governor before he was 60. Della listened to all of it without moving. When Quint had finished, she said only that she would need help breaking the seal, and that she could not pay him in money, only in leather once the works ran again. The old blacksmith looked at her a long moment. Then he said he had not been paid in anything worth having for 9 years, and that he would take that trade. What she did not yet know was how deep the wrong went, or that the thing in the pit was not the end of the story, but the beginning of it. They began the work of opening the pit on the morning of the 6th day, and they did it the way Augustus would have demanded, slowly and with respect, for what they did not know. Quint had brought iron bars and a long-handled spade and his own great strength, which even at his age was a thing to see. Della had built over the preceding days a frame of green poles over the pit, lashed with rawhide, from which a bucket could be lowered and raised on a rope. They did not pry up the lid all at once. They lifted 1 stone at a time from the covering layer, setting each aside in a row so that nothing would be lost, and then they chiseled out the hard clay from a single seam at the corner, working a narrow gap, and through that gap they let the air of 14 years come up into the daylight before any person put a face near it. The air came up slow and cold and smelling of stone and old tannin, and something fainter underneath that Della could not name. They waited a full day with the gap open before they did anything more, because Augustus had taught her that bad air settles and good air must be let to take its place, and a tanner who hurried a pit was a tanner who drowned in it. On the 7th day Quint lowered a candle on a string into the gap, and it burned steady and clean all the way down, and that told them the air below was fit to breathe. Only then did they lift the timber lid. It took both of them, and the mule, and the better part of the morning, the balks swollen and heavy and grudging, the rawhide ropes creaking, and when the last one slid free and crashed onto the stones, the whole yard seemed to ring with it. Della knelt at the lip and looked down into the pit her teacher had sealed with his own hands 14 years before, and for a moment she did not understand what she was seeing because it was not what she had let herself imagine. The pit was not full of liquor. It had been drained and lined and made dry, and at the bottom, on a platform of cedar planks raised above the stone floor, sat objects wrapped in oiled hide and bound with tarred cord, arranged with the same care a man gives to things he loves and means to be found. Dust hung in the shaft of light that fell past her. The cold of 14 sealed years rose against her face. She did not move for a long moment. Then she went down the ladder, Quint braced for her, rung by rung into the dry stone, cold, and she put her hands on the first wrapped bundle, and her hands were steady. She brought them up one at a time over the rest of that day, and Quint received each one at the lip and laid it on a clean tarpaulin in the shed, and they did not open any of them until every last bundle was up and the pit was empty, and the light was going gold in the west. The cold of the pit clung to the oiled hide of each bundle so that they were cold to hold even in the afternoon sun, cold the way river stones are cold, the cold of a place the warmth of 14 summers had never reached. Some of the bundles were heavy as a sack of meal and some were light, and Della learned the weight of each one in her arms going up the ladder and set them in the order she had found them, because order was a kind of respect, and because Augustus had taught her that a thing's arrangement often told you as much as the thing itself. There were 11 bundles in all. When the last was up, Della sat back on her heels in the lamplight and looked at the row of them, and only then, with Quint's one good eye on her, did she begin to unwrap. The first bundle held ledgers. 3 of them, thick and leather-bound, the leather Reed's own work and still supple under the oiled wrapping, and inside, in Augustus Reed's small upright hand, were the accounts of the Cedar Bench Tannery for every one of the 11 years he had run it. Every hide bought, every customer, every dollar in and out. And clipped inside the third ledger, folded and sealed in wax, was a second set of papers in a different hand. And these were the ones that mattered, though Della did not understand their full weight until Quint, who could read figures better than letters, traced them with a blunt finger and went still. They were loan papers, or they had the shape of loan papers. They recorded a debt of $4,000 owed by Augustus Reed to Emmett Halloran of the Territorial Land Office, secured against the tannery and all its works, signed and dated and witnessed. Clipped to them, though, Augustus Reed had set his own statement, written out and signed and witnessed by a notary in Fort Benton whose stamp was still crisp in the wax, declaring that he had never borrowed $1 from Emmett Halloran in his life, that the signature on the loan papers was a forgery, that Halloran had come to him 3 times demanding he sign a true loan and been refused 3 times, and that Reed, fearing what a powerful man with a forger's patience might do, had drawn up this counterstatement and hidden it where only the right hands would ever find it. He had named the forgery for what it was. He had named the witness on the false papers as a clerk in Halloran's own office. And he had written, at the bottom, in a hand grown shaky near the end, that if these words were ever read aloud it would mean he was dead and his work stolen, and that he asked only one thing of whoever found them. That they finish the work he could not, that they get the leather back to the men he owed it to. Della read that line 3 times. The leather back to the men he owed it to. She did not understand it yet. The other bundles explained it. Wrapped in the oiled hides, packed in dry cedar shavings, were finished pieces of leather, the finest she had ever seen or touched, harness and sole leather and bridle leather, and a great roll of skirting hide for saddles, hundreds of pounds of it, each piece tagged in Reed's hand with a name and a sum. These were orders, paid orders. In the last year of his life, knowing that Halloran meant to take everything, Augustus Reed had taken the leather his customers had already paid for, the orders he could no longer deliver because he knew he would not live to deliver them, and he had hidden them in the one place a thief working through paper would never think to look. Not the strong box, not the bank. The bottom of a tanning pit, sealed under timber and clay in the dry cold where leather would keep for a generation. He had put it where his enemy's instruments could not reach, and he had trusted that the right hands would come. 12 names were tagged on the leather. Della read them all by lamplight. Some she remembered from her years at his elbow, ranchers and freighters and a stage company 40 miles south. Some meant nothing to her. Every one of them, though, was a man who had paid Augustus Reed good money for good leather and received nothing, and had been told, no doubt, that the tannery had failed and the tanner was a debtor, and there would be no refund and no delivery and no recourse. 12 men cheated twice. Once by the failure, once by the lie about why it failed. She understood now what finishing the work meant. It was not revenge. Augustus had not asked her to bring down Emmett Halloran, though she came to see, over the weeks that followed, that the one thing would do the other. He had asked her to make 12 men whole. To deliver the leather they had paid for 14 years late, with the proof of why it was late, and to put into their hands the document that named the debt a forgery and the great man a thief. He had not wanted a gunfight or a hanging. He had wanted his ledger balanced. He had wanted the leather back to the men. He owed it to word of what she had found could not be kept quiet, and Della did not try to keep it quiet, but she was careful about its shape. She did not ride to Helena, waving papers. She had no standing and no money, and a forged debt with her teacher's stolen name on it, and she knew, because Quint told her plainly, and because she had the sense to listen, that a girl of 19 accusing an assemblyman of forgery would be laughed out of the territory or worse. So she did the patient thing. She did the tanner's thing. She began with the leather. The first delivery she made was to the nearest name on the tags, a freighter named Orrin Black, who ran a string of wagons out of a station 9 miles down the valley. She and Quint loaded the harness leather meant for him onto the mule and walked it down, and when they reached the station, Della laid the harness across the rail and unrolled it and showed Orrin Black the tag with his own name and the date, 14 years gone, and the sum he had paid, and she told him, plainly and without heat, what had happened to the tannery and to the man who ran it. Orrin Black was a hard man near 60, who had assumed for 14 years that he had simply been robbed by a tanner who took his money and folded, and he stood there with his thumb working the grain of leather that was better than anything he had bought since, and his face changed slowly as he understood. He had paid for this. It had existed the whole time. The man he had cursed for a thief had died, protecting it for him. He asked her what she wanted. She told him she wanted nothing but a witness. She wanted him to keep the harness, which was his, and to remember what she had told him and be willing to say it aloud if a day came when saying it would matter. Orrin Black looked at her a long while. Then he said that he had buried Augustus Reed himself, that no one else would do it, that he had thought at the time he was burying a man who had cheated him, and that he had carried that meanness in him for 14 years, and would be glad to set it down. He would witness. He would say it anywhere. She asked. He walked her to the edge of his yard when she left, and he stopped her with a hand that did not quite touch her sleeve, and he asked one more thing, in the rough way of a man unused to asking. He asked where Reed was buried because he had marked the grave with a flat stone and no name being too sour at the time to spend a word on it, and he found that he wanted to cut the name in. Now Della told him. She told him the spot above the bench where the pines broke and a person could see the whole fold of ground the tannery sat in, and Orrin Black nodded slowly and said he would do it that week, and he did. The stone reads the name and the trade and nothing else, because Augustus Reed had never wanted more than to be known for what he made. That was the first. There were 11 more. Della delivered them through the back end of that autumn and into the first hard weather, one at a time, on foot and by mule, sometimes walking 2 days to reach a name. She did not hurry, and she did not skip a man because he was far or poor or dead. Where the man named on the tag had died, she found his widow or his son and put the leather in their hands and told them the truth, and she let them keep what their husband or father had paid for. One delivery she remembered all her life. A name on a tag led her 30 miles south to a sod house on a wind-scoured flat, where a woman near 70 lived alone with a half-blind dog and a stove that drew badly. The woman's husband had paid Reed for a set of plow harness the spring before he died, and had gone to his own grave believing the tanner had stolen the last good money the family ever had. Della unrolled the harness on the woman's plank table in the bad light, and the woman put both hands flat on it and did not speak for a long time. And then she said her husband had cursed Augustus Reed with nearly his last breath, and asked in a voice gone thin whether there was any way now to take a curse back. Della told her there was. She told her to keep the harness, and to remember that the man had not been a thief, but the one person who had tried to protect what was owed. The old woman folded a corner of the leather against her cheek the way a person holds a thing that has come back from the dead, and Della left her like that and walked out into the cold and did not let herself stop until the house was below the horizon. She kept nothing for herself but the cost of the journey, a little flour, a little powder, the use of Quint's mule. She might have sold that leather for more money than she had ever held in her life. She gave all of it away because Augustus had not written "Get the leather back and sell it." He had written "Get the leather back" to the men he owed it to, and she had stood at his deathbed and understood, finally, what he meant about leather and justice, both needing patience, both refusing to be hurried, both worth nothing at all if you cut the corner. Stay with her a moment here, because this is the part the loud men at the auction never imagine when they laugh. The work was not the finding. The finding was a single morning. The work was the 400 miles she walked that winter to put 12 wrongs right one at a time, and no one watching. By the turn of the year she had delivered all 12, and she had something Emmett Halloran, in his tall stone house in Helena, could not buy or burn or forge his way around. She had 12 witnesses. 12 men and families who had held in their hands the leather they had been told never existed, who had heard the truth of the tannery from the only person alive who had been there at the end, and who were angry now with the particular slow anger of people who have learned they were lied to about a dead man they wronged in their hearts. She had the ledgers, she had the notarized counterstatement with the crisp Fort Benton stamp. She had the false loan papers themselves with their forged signature, which she had brought up out of the pit and not let out of her sight since. And she had Tobias Quint, who remembered the 3 visits and the night of sealing, and who would say so. She did not take it to Halloran. She took it to a lawyer. The lawyer was a young man in the territorial capital named Wesley Coe, not much older than Della herself, who had no love for the men who ran the assembly and no fortune to lose by crossing them, and who looked at the papers spread across his desk for the better part of an afternoon, and then looked at Della, standing there in her patched coat with the leather-handled tools her teacher had given her, hanging at her belt, and asked her why she had not simply sold the leather and walked away rich and unbothered. She told him what Augustus had told her, the leather back to the men he owed it to. Coe was quiet a while. Then he said that in 11 years of practice he had met perhaps 3 people he believed completely, and that she was the third, and that he would take the case for nothing but the satisfaction of it, because a man who forged a dead tanner's name to steal his works ought not to be governor of anything. He turned the false loan papers under the window light as he said it, and he set them beside a page of Reed's true ledger hand, and he asked her to look. The forger had been good. The slant was close, the loops near enough that a busy clerk would pass them. The man had not been good enough, though, to forge the way a hand tires across a long line, the small, honest unevenness of a real signature, written 10,000 times in a working life. And once Coe pointed to it, Della could not stop seeing it, the dead giveaway of a careful hand pretending to be a careless one. Coe said a judge could be made to see it too, given the notary's stamp and the witnesses to stand behind it. He gathered the papers and locked them in an iron box and told her to go home and make leather and let him do the slow part, and to trust that slow was not the same as nothing. I will not pretend it was swift, because it was not, and Augustus Reed had told the truth when he said justice could not be hurried. It took the better part of 2 years. The thing about physical evidence, though, about a forged signature set beside a true one, and a notary's stamp that no one can argue with, and 12 plain men who will stand up in a room and say what they held in their hands, is that it does not depend on a girl being believed. It depends only on the paper being shown. Wesley Coe showed it. He showed it to a territorial judge, and then, when the assembly tried to bury it, to a newspaper in the East that had been looking for a reason to write about corruption in the Western land offices, and the paper printed the whole of Augustus Reed's counterstatement under a headline that traveled back across the country and into the stone house in Helena. Emmett Halloran was never tried. That is the part people find unsatisfying, and Della found it so herself at first, till she understood it. He was never dragged into a courtroom and never made to stand and answer, because men like Halloran are protected by other men, and the protection held just well enough to keep him out of a cell. It did not hold his name, though. Once the forgery was printed, Once it was known that the great man's fortune had a stolen tannery at the bottom of it, and a dead man's hidden ledgers proving it, the men who had meant to make him governor stepped quietly back, the way men step back from a thing that has begun to stink. His seat in the assembly was not renewed. The bank that had carried him called its notes. Within 3 years he had sold the tall stone house and gone east himself, to relatives, to silence, and the territory that had been about to crown him forgot him with the speed of a place that is embarrassed to remember. He was not punished, he was simply undone, and undone by the weight of what a careful dying man had hidden in a hole in the ground, which is a slower thing than a hanging and, Della came to think, a heavier one. She got the tannery back. That was the part the law could do cleanly. Once the debt was shown to be a forgery, the seizure was void, and the works at Cedar Bench reverted to the estate of Augustus Reed, who had died without heirs of his blood. He had left a will after all, though, drawn up in the same careful month he sealed the pit, and it had been folded inside the third ledger all along, and had left the tannery and everything in it to his apprentice, named in full, Della Fenn, the only person who ever listened to the whole of an answer. She had owned it in truth since the day she paid her $1. She had only had to dig up the proof. She did not become rich. She became a tanner. She ran the works at Cedar Bench for 41 years, and she ran them in the old way Augustus had taught her, slowly, with respect for what could not be hurried, and the leather that came out of that fold of ground below the bench was known again from Fort Benton to the Yellowstone as the best a man could buy. The drying sheds got their roofs back, the bark mill turned again, the spring ran clean, and the great pit at the center of the yard, the one that had been sealed for 14 years and held the truth all that while, she cleaned and lined and put back into use, because a good pit was too valuable to waste on memory, and because Augustus would have said the same. Tobias Quint worked beside her for the rest of his life, paid at last in leather and in the only thing he had wanted, which was useful work and a person who knew his worth. When he died, an old man, Della tanned the hide of a steer he had favored and made it into a single long strop and kept it on the wall of the shed, and she sharpened her knives on it every working morning for the rest of her days, and that was how she carried him. The men who had laughed at the auction did not in the main come and apologize, because men of that kind rarely do, and Della did not wait for it. Sumter Pyle, though the heavy land agent who had sold her the works for $1 and laughed loudest, came down the track one spring some years on with his hat in his hands, older and poorer and quieter than he had been, and stood at the edge of the yard the way Quint had stood that first week. He did not say he was sorry. He said he had a horse that needed a new harness, and he had heard the best in the territory was made here, and he could pay. Della looked at him a long moment, the way her teacher had taught her to take the measure of a thing before she touched it. Then she said she would make his harness, and she would make it well, and she charged him the fair price and not a cent more. And she did not mention the $1. The work said what needed saying. It always had. She kept the leather-handled tools Augustus had pressed into her hands until they wore down to slivers, and when the wood of the handles finally split, she did not throw them away. She set them on a shelf above the bench where the light from the western window fell on them in the last hour of each working day, beside the strop made from Quint's steer, and she would look at them sometimes when the day's work was done and the fires were banked for the night. On the evening she was an old woman herself. Near the end of her long run at the works, a young man came down the track looking for an apprenticeship, a thin, watchful boy from a failing place who asked good questions, and she took him on because she remembered what it was to be taken on. And because the chain of a thing well taught is the only inheritance that cannot be forged or stolen or sealed in a pit, she showed him the pits first. She told him a tanner's patience was the most important thing he owned, because leather could not be hurried, and neither could justice, and the two were more alike than most men knew. The boy did not understand that last part. He was 15, she told him he would. The last light came through the western window and lay across the worn tools on the shelf and the long strop on the wall. And Della banked the fire and stood a moment in the quiet of the work she had dug the truth out of with her own hands. Then an old woman, in a place that was hers because she had not looked away from a hole in the ground that everyone else had sealed and forgotten. Outside, the spring ran clean down its stone channel in the dark, the way it had run for a man 50 years dead, the way it would run for the boy when she was gone. What would you have done with 11 bundles in the cold and dark, knowing you could keep them or give them away? Sit with that a while. And if a story of a thing the world threw away, and a person patient enough to dig out the truth, is the kind of story that holds you, there are others like it, waiting, and they begin, every one, with someone refusing to look away.